I'm Cliff Ribner, and I'm going to talk to you today about collectivism and how it's inherently unjust and inherently antithetical to everything we actually want, everything everybody really wants. The only way people go for collectivism is when they're tricked into thinking that they want it. Like with this nonsense in New York now, where this guy Mandani got elected. He's a communist. He admits it. Everybody knows what happens when communism is imposed on a society. This is not debatable. We've seen it. There are places where this has been done, and it's a nightmare. But there's a very specific reason for it. It's because under communism, the government has a monopoly of everything. It takes everyone's property away, and it dispenses it as it sees fit. But the problem is the government can't do that with any competence. It doesn't have any competence. The only power the government has is the power of violence. That's its only power. It doesn't produce anything of value because only real people do. And the people who work in the government are not real people in that sense. They're not producing anything. They're politicians. They attain their power within the government by manipulating, well, they may be elected. They can be elected and appointed by elected people. But fundamentally, in a government, in a communist society, they're all sociopaths in the government because nobody else would want to be in it. And the problem is once sociopaths are admitted into the government, they will make sure, because they're willing to do anything, including murder. There's no limits on what sociopaths will do to attain and retain power. And that type of power is exclusively the power of violence. There's two types of power. There's what's called market power and the power of violence. And with the government, its job is to monopolize violence within society, prevent other people, prevent citizens from doing violence to each other. That's its one job. And the way it does that is by enforcing the laws in courts. That's the way laws are enforced, by prosecutors bringing cases against people after the people have acted. The government's not supposed to be in the business of requiring us to seek its permission to do things. If that's in a society where you have to go and get permission from the government to do anything, it's not a free society. It's not even close to it. That's a society in which the government controls everything. And that's, in effect, communism. That's a form, and what I'm illustrating is collectivism is inherent in all these things, in communism and in a government where you have to seek permission. Those are both collectivist societies. And in both of them, the government's in charge. That's the whole nature of having to seek its permission. That means the government is in charge and the citizens are not. So the citizens are not free to engage in their own business as they see fit. Now, bear in mind, it's not that there aren't laws which affect the citizens in conducting their business. It's not, Elizabeth Warren says, oh, it's just the Wild West. These people are predators. They're going to prey on everybody and to be absolutely outrageous. And when the whole point of view she's expressing is the attitude of communists. And there's no difference between communism and socialism. Karl Marx was the ultimate propagandist for communism when he produced the Communist Manifesto in 1848, and he continued to write during the entire 19th century until he died. I think he died in 1870. It was right after the Civil War. And of course, he was not an American. But anyway, he called himself a social, or he talked about communism and socialism as being interchangeable, and they are, because in both of them, the government controls everything. It doesn't matter whether it owns everything. It doesn't need to own everything to control it. And that was the idea that Woodrow Wilson understood when he was a government professor before he became governor of New Jersey and then president of the United States. And by the way, he's basically the godfather of the Democrat Party. Ever since he got into power in the Democrat Party, they had an ideology that they attempted to impose on America. It's basically a communist front group. I mean, it sounds crazy to say it, but it's true, because the stuff that Woodrow Wilson wanted to be done is all the things that are done in a communist society. He recognized, he had the insight that you don't have to take title to the property. Like the crudest communists, people like Castro, literally just stole everything and made it the government's property. Nobody got paid anything for it. There were people who thought they could deal with Castro, and all that happened is they got murdered about a week later than they would have otherwise. And that's what happens in communist societies, because what it is, what we want in order to be happy, in order for people to be happy, which is the purpose of government, to make us happier than we would be in a state of nature. And what Thomas Hobbes observed is that in a state of nature, there is no rule of law. But there are rules that apply. It's not like it's just anarchy and everybody is free to do whatever they want. And by the way, there were groups of people, I don't think they're very common anymore, who call themselves anarchists. And they thought that they could have a society where there was no government at all. In Karl Marx's Communist Manifesto, or at least in his writings, he envisioned the day when everybody would be transformed. It required a change of human nature, to the point that people didn't have any interest in having their own property, because and that's a mindset that requires the complete destruction of all human nature, because the human nature always is the humans want to have property. It's you look at an infant, the next words that babies learn after mommy and daddy is mine. It's ubiquitous. Little kids will show you that they care about what belongs to them. And they're not just little kids, and that's not something human beings ever grow out of. That is part of human nature expressing itself through the mouth of a little kid. Anyway, there is no such thing as a society where there is no law at all. Because what happens is, if there's no rule of law, then what you have is a state of nature. And what a state of nature is, survival of the fittest, which is really a situation where power of it becomes whoever is the most violent wins. That's what happens in a state of nature. It's the strongest in terms of being able to have the power of violence, because the power of violence always defeats the power of market power. And what market power is, by the way, it's very interesting. Market power is a power that it expresses itself from other people. And the way that does is, market power is when you have something that other people want to buy, that people want to pay for. And the more market power you have, the richer you get, and the more people want to buy what you have. And if you have something that everybody wants to buy, it doesn't matter whether it's a lot of money. You're going to get rich, obviously, but it means you're making something that is of great value to many people. And the more market power people have, the more they benefit society. It's that simple. Communists hate market power. And what they do is they crush it, because all communists don't believe in such a thing as market power. They think it's just a fraud. They think when people buy things from business people, it's because they're forced to. They think the only power is the power of violence, that all businessmen are thieves, and that they're out there to harm their customers and their employees. They really believe this. And that's why they need all these, that's why businessmen have to go to the government in a communist society or a collectivist one to ask permission. And that's the rule of law in Europe, by the way. It always has been. And that has been being imposed on us bit by bit in America. All of those administrative agencies, that's what they do. They set up rules that require asking them to approve of what business people do. Each one of those agencies has a particular area that their permission is required, and that they're allowed to dictate rules and give orders to people. Like the SEC, they are in charge completely of when people sell stock. They're allowed to tell people not to speak. It's incredible. Everything about them violates the Constitution. They put people in jail if they say things at the wrong time, according to the SEC. Like and I'm talking about officers and directors of corporations. They are forced to be quiet about all sorts of things. They're not allowed to communicate directly in the way that they might want. And so this is all based on the idea that they're out to defraud everybody. And the SEC doesn't want the original rule of law of fraud to apply. They want to prevent fraud before it occurs. That's what and they think everyone who sells stock, all they want to do is defraud everybody. Even though if that's the way they did it, they'd be out of business in no time at all. Nobody would want to do business with them, because the nature of real business is businessmen, in order to succeed in a market where they're dealing with other businessmen, like when they're selling stock, where it's basically a sophisticated public that's buying what they're selling. Poor people don't buy stock. And that's what the SEC is looking at, a situation where they claim that they're protecting, or they don't even claim that they're protecting the buyers. They claim they're protecting the market. They can't identify anybody who they're protecting. And they have imposed rules permitting people to sue based on claims that, I won't even get into the details of what it is, but it's based on claims that people can harm the market, even though there's no one specifically who was ever harmed by the action. So they literally put people in jail for violating stuff when you cannot identify a victim. Under the common law, which is what we had before all these agencies, and which is the rule of free men, and which is the application of the Ten Commandments to real life, nobody had to ask permission to engage in their business. That's the way it's supposed to be, by the way. And the way people were punished for doing the wrong thing was either if they actually defrauded somebody or did some other bad thing to someone that caused them harm, the person they harmed could sue them. And there are specific torts, that's what they're called, specific torts that are involved in the business community or in business transactions, or could apply. But they only apply after the fact. Nobody has to ask permission. And if they harm someone, the person they harm can sue them. And the basis on which they're liable has to do with them doing something wrong, either deliberately or just even negligently. But they have to intend a wrong, and they are punished either by paying damages to someone, by being sued, or they could commit a crime. But even the crime is dealt with by a prosecutor bringing a case against them. They have to be convicted, and then they can be punished. But nobody's giving them orders in advance about what they have to do. And that's what all of these agencies do. They give orders in advance of people taking actions. And that is forbidden under our rule of law. And that's what the real rule of law is. When the common law exists and people are free in the first instance to act as they want, they are prevented from continuing to do that if they do wrong, because they're going to get put out of business. That's what happens. That's the real punishment for businessmen who do wrong. They literally can't do business because ultimately honor matters in the business world. Anyway, I'm showing you that the rule of law is a very special thing, and it's the only place that there is really a just society. In a just society, people are rewarded for doing good or for providing benefits for other people. That's how they get rich, by providing benefits. Or they are punished for doing harm to people. That's what a just society is, where everyone gets what they deserve. And we all know instinctively that's the way things are supposed to be in a just society. But in order for there to be a just society, there has to be a rule of law. And without a rule of law, anytime what you end up with is it's always the rule by the heart, by the strongest. And when these agencies are there, it's the absence of the real rule of law, because it distorts their presence distorts the market, because it distorts decisions that sellers make about their own products. It forces them, in many cases, there's entire agencies that do nothing but tell people who produce certain types of products how to do it and what they're allowed to design it. Like, they're called consumer agencies. This is something, it actually be the first time a socialist managed to get something done in the name of consumers, or in terms of having one of these agencies. was when the FDA was created. The FDA does nothing of value for actual citizens. What it does is it issues orders permitting the sale of any food and drug. They're not the producers of food and drug in America are not allowed to sell to us without having the FDA approve. So what they do is that they prevent us from buying things that we might want to buy. For example, every drug that the FDA approves, it was available for at least 10 years before the final approval takes place. And we're talking about any drug is something that could be a life-saving thing. And anyway, the fact that the FDA approves it means that drug was available for at least a 10-year period. It could be even longer than that, during which the manufacturer was having to jump through all these hoops the FDA creates in order to sell it. And it's only when they finally get the approval that they're allowed to sell it. Except their patent is running the whole time that they're trying to get the FDA to agree to it. They have to prove two things. They have to prove safety, which doesn't take that much time. It's usually very easy to prove if a drug is safe. The big expense is proving the second one, which is efficacy. And this is efficacy according to the standards of the SEC. And the fact that the reason they're making people prove efficacy could be proven by actual customers. Why can't anybody buy a drug once it's proved to be safe at the very least? I mean, but they can't. And what that means, they have to prove efficacy according to statistical models. It's really nuts. For example, if you have drug A that all by itself does nothing for a disease, but if you also take drug B with it, it then cures that disease. The FDA won't approve either one of those based on that. It makes people wait for that because each drug has to be approved for efficacy. This is the kind of crazy rules they have. But the fact that they exist at all, the fact that you have to wait for them to approve it, means for that 10-year period, all those people were deprived of the ability to buy it. And the manufacturer's patent was running, so by the time the drug finally gets approved by the FDA, the patent is practically run out. So the manufacturer only has the use of his patent for a very brief window after that 10 years. And that's why that's one of the reasons why drugs are so expensive. Basically, they're expensive because it takes billions of dollars to run through those tests, proving the efficacy. And by the time, anyway, there are all those expenses involved and that long time period when all the people who would otherwise benefit from that drug are not allowed to buy it, even though they may know about it. And that's just one example of what happens under these agencies. Because what these agencies do is they take away the real rule of law. The real rule of law is when the common law exists and any seller can sell anything that they want to sell. Now, the idea behind these agencies, the underlying concept that permits these agencies to exist in the minds of the people who want them, is the idea that all businessmen are thieves and they want to harm their customers, so the government has to be involved in a strangling manner to prevent them from doing anything without the government's approval. And the government, of course, has no competence to really evaluate anything. And it's not as if all drugs work. And it's not as if drugs don't have side effects. In fact, if you've ever seen, you can't buy a drug without getting these pieces of paper that are a mile long telling you all the terrible things that might happen if you take the drug. That's also mandated by the FDA. And of course, nobody reads that stuff. But what it is, the rule of law would permit, if there was just the rule of law and not the rule by these horrible agencies, they are collectivist. That's collectivism in action, when there's an agency involved requiring permission from the government. Because when it's the government giving its permission, and when we're talking about the government, we're talking about bureaucrats, unelected bureaucrats, using their discretion. That's the most tyrannical rule there is. When you have to go to someone and have them let you do something in its discretion, that is literally the definition of tyranny. And in fact, the Federalist 47 by Madison quoting Montesquieu, he would say that's an image of the terms are, this is the words he uses, the very definition of tyranny, when two powers of the federal government are permitted to exist in one entity. And in that case, the two powers that are allowed to exist are the power to write laws, legislative power, and the judicial power, because they can impose their own orders. Orders under the real system of law can only come from courts after due process, not from these, but under these agencies, all they do is issue orders. They issue orders preventing you from doing things and even permitting them. You have to go to them to permit you to do whatever their jurisdictional thing is. I was using the FDA as an example because that's something we all encounter, or we all are aware of. That if you need a particular drug and it might be available, and the manufacturer can make a decision not to sell a drug based on the concern that the manufacturer might have for the people. But in the government's idea, the manufacturer will sell any poison there is if they can get away with it, and they'll lie to make you do it. So the government controls everything about what the drug maker is allowed to say about the drug. It's violation of freedom of speech right on its face. And it has the judicial power of imposing orders on people, and it has the legislative power of deciding what drug gets approved. That's really making a law. It's making a law on the spot of permitting something to be sold. And they're making legislative and judicial decisions. That's two powers. Arguably, they got the executive power also, which would be a third power of the government. And what it is, this is illustrative of why, when there is rule by these administrative agencies, it overwhelms the common law, because nobody is allowed to act in the first instance. You're under the pressure of having to abide by the orders of these agencies. In many cases, you literally have to go to the agency to ask their permission. And in fact, we saw this during the recent shutdown, when the government shut down. This cost a lot of money, and it's because many businesses simply couldn't operate because there was no agency they could go to ask permission to do what they wanted to do. It doesn't matter if they would have given the permission. If they're not there, you can't get permission. But that's the way these agencies work. Basically it is the law of the jungle. It's the law of power. It's the rule by power, or by naked physical power, because ultimately that's the only power the government has. They have the power to punish you, and they're supposed to monopolize that to prevent us from harming each other, but they also have that threat. If you don't obey them, then they can harm you, so that they really are the biggest bully on the block. And what it is, in order to have freedom, you have to have the rule of law, and you have to have justice. And there is no justice in a society where you have to go to the government to ask for everything. It even poisons the courts. The courts, the judges, they don't take their oath seriously in many cases. But what it is, you want people rewarded for what they do and that benefits other people, and punished for what they do that harms other people. And the laws of the market do that. The laws of the market, and the common law does, the laws of the market, basically, it has to do with supply and demand. If there's no demand for what you're producing, then you're out of business. And that's the law of the market. So there really are rules that apply when the common law is there. And that's the real rule of law, when there's just the common law and the laws of the market, letting them control. So what people want to buy, they're allowed to buy, and what sellers are allowed to sell anything that they think is appropriate. Now, the seller knows they can't sell bad stuff, because then they will be put out of business under the laws of the market. That's the real control. That's why we don't need a nanny state like the government approving or disapproving of each product. And the presence of that power by the government, it overwhelms the market power. It makes everything more expensive. It means businesses have to be huge in order to comply, pay for the cost of complying with all those rules. And there is no that's why the welfare state is part of what goes hand in hand with the administrative state. And this has been a historical fact, The first government that really did the welfare state in the way that with the administrative state, the way we know of it, is Kaiser Wilhelm's Germany. And that's really the model for all this stuff. Theodore Roosevelt thought that was just great. And so did Woodrow Wilson. And the way it's done is through bureaucracy, making people go to bureaucrats who answer only to the politicians who control the country. But it's no longer the rule of law. And it's no longer, because it's all discretionary by those bureaucrats. And that's the law of the jungle. It's indistinguishable from the law of the jungle, where the most powerful run everything. And it's a society where the market doesn't rule, because the market is prevented from ruling. When market power is prevented from ruling, then the market doesn't rule. And that's what you have in a society which is governed by all these administrative agencies interfering with businesses, in fact, controlling the business, taking the power of control away from them, and imposing the law of the jungle, the law of politicians. Politicians are simply people who have power, and that's all they've got. They don't have any ability to produce anything, and because of that, when they control everything, it's just the opposite of the rule of the market. It's the rule of violence, ultimately, because what the politicians have as their one power, they can punish you if you don't go along with what they want. I'm Cliff Ribner, and if you like what I have to say, please tell other people, and please indicate that on YouTube, and go to my website, cliffordribner.com, and read my book, Freedom's Last Stand. Thank you.